For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence told me more than any words could have, because people only stay that quiet when they know something real is unfolding, something they cannot easily dismiss or explain away. And I kept my eyes forward, not searching for sympathy, not waiting for approval, just allowing the truth to continue at its own pace. And I said that the bank had provided me with a full record of those transactions. Every date, every amount, every location where that secondary card had been used, and I did not need to raise my voice or add emotion when I explained that the purchases were not emergencies. They were not necessities. They were things that reflected comfort, preference, even luxury, small at first but growing over time, as if the person using that card had become more confident, more certain that no one was paying attention. And I paused briefly, not to create drama, but because I wanted the details to settle, to be understood clearly, and I continued by saying that what mattered most was not the money itself, because money can be replaced, it always can, but trust, once it is quietly taken apart piece by piece, does not return so easily, and I could feel the shift deepen in the room, the earlier uncertainty now turning into something heavier, something closer to realization, and I finally allowed my gaze to rest on Brittany, not accusing, not dramatic, just steady. And I said that when I asked the bank who had been authorized to reactivate that card, they provided a name. And it was not a stranger. It was not a mistake. It was someone who had stood in my home, sat at my table, shared meals with me, someone I had trusted without hesitation. And I let that truth hang there, not because I needed to build tension, but because I knew everyone in that room was already connecting the pieces on their own, and I did not rush to say her name, because by now, I no longer needed to. The silence itself had already pointed in her direction, and I saw it in the way a few guests glanced toward her, in the way Daniel's expression changed again, this time not just confusion, but something deeper, something harder to ignore, and Brittany shifted her weight, her composure still intact on the surface, but there was a tightness around her eyes now, a calculation, as if she was searching for the right way to respond, the right way to reshape the story before it settled permanently. And I spoke again, still calm, still measured, saying that I had not come here tonight intending to talk about any of this, that I had planned to sit quietly, to celebrate, to let things remain as they were, because for a long time I believed that keeping the peace was the same as protecting the family. But I had come to understand that silence can sometimes protect the wrong things, and that was not something I was willing to do anymore. And I took a slow breath, steady and unhurried, because there was no need for haste now. The room was fully with me, every ear listening, every assumption being reconsidered, and I added, almost gently, that I had given many chances for this to be acknowledged privately, many opportunities for honesty without an audience. But those chances had been ignored, dismissed, or turned into something else entirely, and I let that sentence settle before I finished the thought, saying that tonight was not about embarrassment, not about revenge. It was simply about clarity, because once something reaches a certain point, it can no longer remain hidden without cost. And as I stood there, feeling the calm hold steady inside me, I understood that whatever happened next would not undo what had already been revealed, because the truth, once spoken aloud, has a way of staying in the room long after the words themselves have faded. No one interrupted me this time, not even Brittany, and that was when I understood the shift had already happened, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, irreversible way that could be felt in the stillness of the room. And I let my gaze move slowly across the faces in front of me, not searching for support, not asking for agreement, just acknowledging that they were there, witnessing something they had not expected to see. And I said that I had spent a long time questioning myself, wondering if I had somehow misunderstood, if I had missed something, if perhaps I had become the difficult person I had been described as, because when enough people repeat a version of you, it becomes easy to doubt your own, and I admitted that for a while. I had chosen to believe the softer explanations, the convenient ones that allowed everything to remain unchanged. But the records I had in front of me had not left room for interpretation. They were precise, consistent, and impossible to ignore. And I explained that after receiving those records, I did not act immediately. I did not confront anyone. I did not call attention to it, because I wanted to be certain, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant. And I took the time to review everything carefully, to understand the pattern, the timing, the intent behind it, and what I found was not confusion or accident. It was repetition, it was familiarity, it was the quiet confidence of someone who believed they would never be questioned. And I let that settle before continuing, because I could feel the tension rising. Again, not sharp, but steady, like a line being drawn that everyone could see, but no one wanted to cross first. And I said that what troubled me most was not the access itself, because I had given that willingly once, in a different context, under different circumstances, but the way it had been used without a single conversation, without a single acknowledgement, as if my presence in this family had become something optional, something that could be worked around rather than respected. And I paused again, briefly, because I could feel the weight of that realization pressing into the room, and I turned my attention back to Daniel, because he needed to hear this more than anyone else. And I said that I had always believed trust within a family was not something that needed to be negotiated. It was something that existed quietly in the background, supporting everything else. And once that trust begins to erode, even in small ways, it changes how every moment feels, how every conversation is understood. And I could see him listening now in a way he had not before, not defensive, not dismissive, but present. And that alone told me that something real was happening, something that could not be undone by a quick explanation or a well-placed excuse. And I allowed my voice to soften slightly, not out of weakness, but because clarity does not require force. And I said that I had hoped, more than anything, that this would have been addressed privately, that it would have been acknowledged without needing to stand here in front of everyone. But when that did not happen, when silence continued to protect what should have been questioned, I realized that staying quiet was no longer the right choice. And I let that thought linger before I finished, because by now, every person in that room understood that this was not about a single moment. It was about a pattern that had gone unnoticed for too long. And as I stood there, steady and composed, I knew that whatever came next would not be about convincing anyone. It would simply be about allowing them to see clearly what had already been there all along. By now, the room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a place where something had been uncovered that could not be put back the way it was. And I could see it in the way people held themselves, quieter, more attentive, as if they were carefully reconsidering everything they had assumed before I spoke. And I did not rush to fill that space because I understood that this was the moment when truth settles, when it moves from being heard to being understood. And I let my eyes rest on Daniel again, not with expectation, but with a quiet invitation for him to see clearly what had been in front of him all along. And I said that there was one final part of this that mattered, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, and simplicity has a way of making things undeniable. And I explained that after reviewing the records, after confirming the details, I had made a decision, not out of anger, not out of impulse, but out of clarity. And that decision was to close the account entirely, to remove any access that had once been given, because trust, once broken, cannot continue to operate as if nothing has changed. And I could feel the shift again, deeper this time, because this was no longer about what had happened. It was about what would happen next. And I added, calmly, that I had also spoken with the bank about the transactions themselves, not to escalate anything, but to ensure that everything was documented properly, that nothing would remain unclear or unresolved. And I did not need to explain further. The meaning of that was already understood, and for the first time, Brittany moved as if she might speak, her lips parting slightly, her posture changing as though she was preparing to step in and redirect the moment. But she hesitated, just for a second, and in that second, the room remained with me, not turning toward her, not waiting for her explanation, and that hesitation said more than anything she could have spoken. And I continued, not looking at her now, but addressing the room as a whole, saying that I had never wanted to stand here and talk about private matters in a public space, that it was not something I found satisfaction in. But there are moments when silence stops being respectful and starts becoming enabling, and I was no longer willing to confuse the two. And I let that thought settle before I took a slow breath, steady and unshaken, because I could feel the calm holding me in place, stronger than anything else in that room. And I said that family, at its best, is built on mutual respect, not convenience, not quiet assumptions, not stories told in someone else's absence. And when that respect is no longer present, it does not disappear quietly. It shows itself in small ways, in overlooked details, in decisions made without conversation, in words spoken when someone believes they will not be challenged, and I allowed my gaze to return to Brittany one last time, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm certainty that required no explanation, and I said, gently but clearly, that I had given more than I was ever asked for, willingly and without keeping score, but I would not continue to give in a space where I was not respected, and I let that final sentence settle, not needing to add anything else, because by now, the room understood exactly what it meant, and as I stood there, microphone still in my hand, I realized that I was no longer waiting for anyone to respond, no longer hoping for acknowledgement or apology, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It had been seen, it had been heard, and it would not be forgotten. I lowered the microphone slightly, not because I had finished, but because I no longer needed to hold the room with words. The truth had already done that for me. And in that quiet, something shifted again, more visibly this time. People no longer looked at me with curiosity. They looked at Brittany with a kind of measured distance, the kind that comes when admiration quietly dissolves into doubt. And I noticed how the energy that once centered around her had loosened, like a spotlight dimming, without anyone touching the switch. And for the first time that evening, she stepped forward, her voice softer than before, controlled, careful, as if she was choosing each word with precision, trying to regain something that had already slipped away, and she said my name in a tone that sounded almost reasonable, almost composed, suggesting there had been a misunderstanding, that things had been handled differently than I believed, that perhaps we should talk about this privately, and I listened without interrupting, not because I was considering her words, but because I recognized the shift in strategy, the movement from confidence to containment, from control to damage management, and when she finished, I did not respond immediately. I let her explanation rest in the room, just long enough for everyone to feel its weight, or rather, its lack of it, and then I lifted the microphone again, not higher, not dramatically, just enough to be heard clearly, and I said that I agreed with her on one thing, that matters like this are usually handled privately, but privacy requires honesty, and honesty had not been present when it mattered most. And I could see a few people nod subtly, not openly, but enough to signal that the balance had shifted, and I turned slightly toward Daniel, because this was no longer just between Brittany and me. It had never truly been, and I said his name calmly, not as an accusation, not as a plea, but as an acknowledgement, and I told him that I had never expected perfection from anyone, not from him, not from his wife, not from myself, but I had always expected truth, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it required difficult conversations, and I paused there, because I wanted him to hear that clearly, without distraction, and I added that the hardest part of this was not what had been taken, it was what had been assumed, that I would not notice, that I would not question, that I would simply continue as I had before, quietly supporting, quietly stepping aside. And I let that settle before I finished, because I could see it reaching him now, not fully, not all at once, but enough to begin, and as I stood there, steady, composed, I realized that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about drawing a line that had been missing for far too long, and I did not need to raise my voice or extend the moment any further, because everything that needed to be understood had already been said, and in that stillness, with the room watching and the truth fully present, I placed the microphone back on the stand with the same quiet care I had used to pick it up, knowing that what remained now would not be decided by words, but by what each person chose to do with what they had just witnessed. No one rushed to fill the silence after I set the microphone down, and that was how I knew the moment had already settled into something permanent, something that would not be undone by a quick explanation or a polite attempt to move on. And I did not look back at Brittany as I stepped away from the stage, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left for me to confirm, nothing left for me to prove. And for the first time in a very long while, I felt no need to stay where I was not respected, so I walked slowly across the ballroom, not hurried, not dramatic, just steady, aware of the way the room shifted as I moved through it. Conversation still paused, eyes following quietly, not with judgment now, but with a kind of awareness that had not been there before. And as I reached the edge of the room, I heard my name, not sharply, not defensively, but uncertainly, and I turned just enough to see Daniel standing a few steps behind me, his expression no longer distant, no longer dismissive, but searching, as if he was trying to understand something that had only just become clear to him. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, because some things cannot be rushed into words, and I could see that he wanted to say something, perhaps to explain, perhaps to ask, perhaps simply to close the distance that had grown between us over time. But I did not step closer, and I did not ask him to. Because clarity does not always require immediate resolution. Sometimes it simply requires space. And I told him quietly that I would not continue as things had been, that I was not walking away from him, but I was stepping away from what had been allowed to continue for too long. And I saw that land with him in a way my earlier words had not, because now it was not just truth, it was consequence. And consequence has a way of making things real. And I offered him a small nod, not cold, not distant, just final in its own quiet way, before I turned back toward the exit. And as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the noise of the ballroom fading behind me, I felt something unfamiliar settle into place, not relief, not sadness, but something steadier, something that felt like balance, because for years I had adjusted myself to keep others comfortable. I had stayed silent to preserve something that was slowly being taken apart, and tonight, I had chosen differently, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly. And as I walked toward my car under the soft glow of the parking lot lights, I understood that whatever happened next would not be about returning to what was, because that version no longer existed. It would be about what each of us chose to build from this point forward. And for the first time, I was certain that I would not be building it alone, because even if no one said it out loud, the truth had already changed the way they saw everything, and that was something no one could take back.